U.S. and Cuba have been at odds since the Cold War, when Fidel Castro allowed Russia to place nuclear missiles on the island 90 miles south of the United States. But even before that, the United States did not support the Castro regime and its communist agenda. Eventually, the circumstances led the United States and then President John F. Kennedy to instate a temporary embargo on February 7, 1962, which has stood until December 2014, when President Barack Obama began to restore relationships with Cuba. The embargo restricted two very popular things from being traded between the two countries: Cuba's famous cigars and American automobiles. Because of this, Cuban cigars are banned from being imported to the U.S., and the classic American cars of the 1950s and 60s are still being driven on the streets of Havana to this day. Now that relations are restored, people will be able to travel to and from each country. American credit cards are now accepted in Cuba, and Cuban cigars will be allowed to be imported into the U.S.
The United States has also created refugee programs that allow Cubans to defect from their home country to the United States and become citizens. Many Cuban Americans settled in southern Florida prior to defection, and many famous baseball players also defected, including Yasiel Puig and brothers Livan and El Duque Hernandez. Cuba has a very rich culture. Like in the United States, their national pastime is baseball, and they are very famous for their distinctive food and music. In the last 10 months, things have changed dramatically. After about half a century of enmity and 18 months of secret negotiations between Cuba and America, it was announced recently that the U.S. would reestablish diplomatic relations, dismantling the last pillar of the Cold War. This was sparked by the release of formerly detained U.S. aid contractor Alan Gross. Cuban President Raul Castro has issued statements agreeing and displaying support for future dialogue with the United States on world as well as domestic issues. Many citizens are happy and excited about the normalization announcement, as it would cause more money and more visits from Cubans in the United States. As of December of 2014, Obama has stated that he will be reinstating the diplomatic relationship between the United States and Cuba. Obama said that he wants to cut loose those shackles of the past. Pope Francis orchestrated the negotiations between Raul Castro and President Barack Obama. Without the Pope, none of this would have been possible. The reopening of relations was important for Raul Castro, as he will be resigning in 2018, and the United States as well, who has a large growing Cuban American population. The news was met with much support from the people of both nations. The new relationship will also help the U.S. promote democracy throughout a once closed nation, as well as form a new trading partner for the United States, stimulating the economies of both nations as well as reconnecting the families that were broken by this embargo. However, many Republican politicians disagree with Obama's decision to lift the embargo, stating Obama is cutting Cuba too much slack and claiming that it is a form of appeasement, and asking questions as to why it is necessary.
For the first time since 1961, the United States is beginning to reopen relations with Cuba and ceasing to consider Cuba a terrorist state. A historic move towards this was on Tuesday, when the New York Cosmos of the North American Soccer League celebrated the reopening of relations by playing a friendly match against Cuba's national team in Havana at the National Stadium. The Cosmos won 4-1, and the match was publicized heavily due to its date relative to the U.S. reopening relations with Cuba. Future plans include the United States planning to open an embassy in Cuba, and more friendly soccer games to be played in the future, both on Cuban and American ground.
It was from the Cuban national team in red. Number 2, Baquero in the 51st minute. That's all they were able to score, though, despite a better second half. Final score in this one ends up with the Cosmos beating the Cuban national team by a 4-1 score. A good night for Gio Savarese and his New York Cosmos.